A chance encounter. The city streets hummed with the usual evening chaos, honking cars, hurried footsteps, and distant sirens wailing through the towering buildings. Nathaniel Miller pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked, trying to ignore the chill that seeped through his clothes. It had been another long day at work, the kind that left him drained before he even made it home. His boss had spent the day nitpicking his every move. His coworkers barely acknowledged his presence, and worst of all, his bank account was nearly empty again. Rent was due, his fridge was practically barren, and he had a stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter waiting to suffocate him. He let out a tired sigh, shoving his hands deep into his pockets as he turned onto a quieter street, lined with closed shops and flickering neon signs. That was when he saw her. A small figure sat hunched against a brick wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, as if she could shrink into herself and disappear. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves over her face, obscuring her expression, but Nathaniel could see her shivering in the cold. Beside her, a tattered backpack, patched together with duct tape, rested like a lifeline. Nathaniel hesitated mid-step. He had walked past countless homeless people before. It was an unfortunate reality of city life. But something about this girl, something in the way she hugged herself so tightly, made him stop. He turned back, approaching slowly. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice soft so he wouldn't startle her. "You okay?" The girl flinched at first, then lifted her head slightly, revealing tired brown eyes that carried an exhaustion far beyond her years. She eyed him warily, her small frame tensing as if ready to bolt at any moment. "I'm fine," she murmured. Nathaniel crouched down to her level. "Doesn't look like it." She said nothing, turning her gaze away. Nathaniel glanced at her backpack, which looked like it had been through a war, and then back at her thin jacket, which was doing little to shield her from the cold. He let out a breath, reaching into his pocket. "Here," he said, pulling out a wrapped sandwich. It wasn't much, just something he had packed that morning, but never got around to eating. The girl's eyes flickered with suspicion. "I don't take handouts." Nathaniel chuckled dryly. "Trust me, if you knew how broke I was, you wouldn't think this was charity. Just take it." She hesitated before slowly reaching out and taking the sandwich. Carefully, she unwrapped it, as if afraid it would disappear. When she took a bite, her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, but her eyes never left him. "What's your name?" Nathaniel asked. She chewed slowly before mumbling, "Lena." "Nice to meet you, Lena." "I'm Nathaniel." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the city. "Where's your family?" he asked gently. Lena's grip on the sandwich tightened. "Gone." Nathaniel swallowed. He knew that tone, detached, guarded. It was the voice of someone who had been abandoned too many times to count. For a moment, he debated what to say next. He wasn't exactly in a position to help anyone. He could barely keep himself afloat. But he couldn't just leave her here, not when the temperature was dropping and she had nowhere to go. He ran a hand through his hair, thinking, "Look, I know you don't know me, and I know you don't trust me. But I can't just walk away and pretend I didn't see you sitting here." Lena watched him carefully. "I don't need help." He let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, neither do I, but here we are." She studied him for a long moment, her brown eyes scanning his face as if searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, just for the night." Nathaniel nodded, offering her a small smile. "Deal." As they stood up, Lena grabbed her backpack, slinging it over her shoulder. The weight of it seemed far too heavy for someone her size, and Nathaniel couldn't help but wonder what little belongings she had managed to keep inside. They walked in silence toward his apartment, the city lights casting long shadows as they moved. Nathaniel wasn't sure what he had just gotten himself into, but deep down, he had a feeling that this night would change everything. A place to stay. The walk to Nathaniel's apartment was quieter than he expected. Lena kept her head down, her small frame barely visible under the streetlights. The city hummed around them. Cars speeding by, neon signs flickering in half-lit storefronts, distant voices murmuring in alleyways. But in their little bubble of silence, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Nathaniel had never been the type to bring strangers home, much less a homeless kid. He wasn't sure what he was thinking. He could barely take care of himself, let alone someone else. But something about Lena's eyes haunted him. The way she clutched that torn-up backpack like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. The way she had hesitated before taking the sandwich, as if she wasn't used to kindness. As they reached the steps of his apartment building, Lena hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. "You coming?" Nathaniel asked, looking back at her. She glanced up at the towering brick structure, her expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" He let out a dry chuckle. Not even a little. That seemed to amuse her, if only for a second. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and followed him inside, a home unlike any other. The building smelled of old wood and something vaguely metallic, like rusted pipes. The elevator was out of service, again. So they took the stairs, the dim hallway lights flickering as they climbed. When they reached Nathaniel's apartment, he fumbled with his keys before pushing the door open. "Welcome to Casa de Nathaniel," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Lena hesitated at the threshold, scanning the space with wary eyes before cautiously stepping inside. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a tiny living room, and a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. But it was clean. The couch was slightly worn, the coffee table was stacked with unopened mail, and a single potted plant sat in the corner, somehow still alive despite his neglect. "You live here alone?" Lena asked, dropping her backpack near the door. "Yeah," Nathaniel said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Unless you count the cockroach I keep trying to evict." She snorted, the first real sound of amusement she had made all night. Nathaniel walked to the fridge, pulling it open to reveal not much. A half-empty carton of milk, some eggs, and a takeout box that was probably older than it should be. "Not exactly a feast," he admitted, "but there's cereal if you are still hungry." Lena shook her head. The sandwich was enough. He nodded, then gestured toward the couch. "You can crash here. It's not much, but it's better than a sidewalk." Lena eyed the couch like it was some foreign object. "You don't have to do this, you know." Nathaniel sighed, plopping down into a chair. "I know." She was silent for a long time before finally sitting down, pulling her knees up to her chest. She didn't take off her shoes, didn't let her guard down. Nathaniel wasn't sure how long they sat there in silence, but eventually he leaned his head back, exhaustion creeping in. "Why were you out there alone?" he asked softly. Lena stiffened but didn't answer. He waited. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Because there's nowhere else." Nathaniel frowned. "No foster homes. Shelters." Her expression darkened. "Been through them all." He exhaled slowly, not pressing further. He could tell she wasn't ready to talk about it. Instead, he stood up. "All right. Well, if you need anything, I'll be in my room." He paused before adding, "And don't steal my stuff." Lena rolled her eyes. "I'm not a thief." "Good," he said with a small smile before heading to his room. A night of unspoken questions. Nathaniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. He kept thinking about the girl in his living room, curled up on his couch like she expected to be thrown out at any moment. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why did he feel like this wasn't just a one-night thing? At some point, exhaustion won over curiosity, and he drifted off into a restless sleep. But in the living room, Lena stayed awake. She had been in strangers' homes before, foster houses, shelters, places that had rules and walls but never felt like home. But this was different. Nathaniel wasn't acting like a savior, wasn't making big promises he couldn't keep. He had just helped. No questions, no expectations. She wasn't sure what to make of that. Curling up tighter, she pulled her backpack closer, fingers brushing against something inside. A piece of paper, worn, crumpled, but important. She had held onto it for years. She closed her eyes, gripping it tight. No one knew her secret, and she wasn't about to tell Nathaniel. Not yet. Secrets beneath the surface. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds, casting soft, golden lines across Nathaniel's small apartment. He stirred, groaning slightly as he turned over, trying to ignore the faint ache in his back from another night of restless sleep. Then it hit him. Lena. His eyes snapped open, and he sat up, heart pounding slightly. Was she still here? Or had she slipped away in the night? Just another fleeting moment in a world full of people who never stayed. Throwing the covers off, he quickly made his way to the living room. To his surprise, she was still there. Curled up on the couch, her small frame barely shifting with each breath, she looked even younger than she had the night before. In the dim morning light, he noticed details he hadn't before, the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the way she hugged her backpack like it contained her entire world. Nathaniel exhaled, rubbing the sleep from his face. He still had no idea what he was doing. What was the plan? Let her stay for a night, maybe two. And then what? He could barely take care of himself, and now he had a kid sleeping on his couch. A kid with secrets. He wasn't stupid. He saw the way she clutched that backpack, the way she avoided talking about her past. Something was off, but he didn't know what. And for some reason, he didn't want to scare her away by asking too soon. For now, breakfast. Breakfast and barriers. Nathaniel made his way to the kitchen, grabbing the only two things he was sure wouldn't kill them if eaten: eggs and toast. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could at least scramble some eggs without setting the apartment on fire. The sound of the sizzling pan must have woken her because, a moment later, he heard quiet footsteps behind him. Lena stood in the doorway, rubbing one eye, her hair a wild mess. "You're cooking?" she asked, voice still thick with sleep. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "That's shocking." She shrugged, stepping into the kitchen but keeping her distance. "Just didn't expect you to still be here." That made him pause. "What, you thought I'd leave you here alone?" She said nothing, just grabbed a glass from the counter and filled it with tap water. Nathaniel frowned but didn't press. Instead, he slid a plate of eggs and toast toward her. "Eat." Lena hesitated, then picked up a piece of toast and took a bite. "Not bad," she mumbled through a mouthful. "Gee, thanks." A few minutes of quiet passed between them, filled only by the sound of forks scraping against plates. Nathaniel could tell she was still wary, still watching him like she was waiting for the moment he would demand answers, but he didn't push. Eventually, though, he had to ask. "What's in the backpack?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Lena's hand froze mid-bite. For a moment, the entire room felt frozen. Then, slowly, she lowered her toast and glanced at him, her face unreadable. "Why do you care?" she asked. Nathaniel shrugged. "I don't really. Just, you hold on to it like it's got the meaning of life inside." Lena didn't answer right away. Instead, she carefully set her plate down and pulled the backpack onto her lap, fingers tracing over the worn patches of duct tape. Finally, she said, "It's mine." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I figured that much." She shot him a glare before looking down at the bag again. "It's all I have left." Something in her voice made his chest tighten. There was no sarcasm, no defensiveness, just raw honesty. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "All right." Lena blinked as if surprised he didn't pry further. "All right." "Yeah. You don't want to tell me what's in it. You don't have to. I just wanted to know why it was so important." She studied him for a long moment before exhaling, some of the tension in her shoulders easing. Most people ask more questions. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. Most people don't bring home stray kids either. Guess I'm full of surprises. Lena let out a small, barely there chuckle. But just as quickly as it came, it disappeared. The offer. After breakfast, Nathaniel hesitated before saying what had been on his mind all morning. So, what's your plan? Lena tilted her head. My plan? Yeah, I mean, you said you'd stay one night. That was last night. You heading somewhere? Something flickered in her eyes. For the first time, she looked unsure. Nathaniel sighed. Look, I'm not saying you can stay here forever. I'm not exactly rolling in cash. But I don't feel right tossing you back out there, either. So if you need a place for a little while, you can stay. Just no stealing, no weird stuff, and you have to actually eat. Lena frowned, clearly trying to figure out if there was a catch. Why would you let me stay? Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair. That was a good question. Honestly, I have no idea. But I'd rather you be here than sleeping on the street. That's all. Lena studied him again, like she was looking for a trap in his words. Finally, she muttered, Okay, just for a little while. Nathaniel nodded. Deal. The start of something bigger. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but there was a subtle shift in the air between them. Lena still kept her walls up, but something about her seemed slightly softer, less on edge. Nathaniel didn't know what the next few days, or even hours, would bring. What he did know was that Lena wasn't just another homeless kid. She was hiding something, and sooner or later he was going to find out what. Neither of them knew that the secret inside that backpack would change everything. A discovery that changes everything. The apartment felt different now. Not bigger, not smaller, just different. Nathaniel couldn't pinpoint what it was, but the presence of Lena shifted the energy. He was used to coming home to silence, to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. But now, there was something else. Someone else. He heard it in the quiet rustling as Lena rearranged her things on the couch. In the way she moved through the space cautiously, as if afraid to leave too big a footprint. In the way she barely spoke unless spoken to. And in the way she never let go of that backpack. Nathaniel wasn't sure what to do with that. He had taken in a stray kid, and he didn't even know her last name. Was he supposed to? Would she even tell him? Maybe she didn't trust him yet. Maybe she never would. And yet there was something in her eyes that told him she wanted to. But trust wasn't given. It was earned. A new routine. For the next couple of days, an unspoken rhythm developed between them. Nathaniel would get up early, make coffee, and slap together some breakfast. Lena would eat with him. Never much, just enough to keep herself going. She never asked for seconds, and he never pushed. Then he'd go to work. And that was the part that nagged at him the most. Leaving her alone. He thought about giving her rules, thought about telling her what she could and couldn't do in his apartment. But the truth was, he wasn't her father. He wasn't even sure what he was. A temporary guardian. A stranger playing savior. So instead, he just left. And every time, he wasn't sure if she'd still be there when he got back. But she always was. And every evening, he would find her exactly where he had left her. Curled up on the couch, knees drawn to her chest, backpack clutched tightly, as if she was constantly ready to run. The first slip. It happened on the third night. Nathaniel had been sitting at the kitchen table, half listening to the TV, while Lena quietly flipped through an old magazine she had found in the apartment. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "You work at Lancaster and Hayes, right?" Nathaniel froze. The fork halfway to his mouth suddenly felt like lead. He turned slowly. "Yeah. How do you know that?" Lena didn't look up. She was pretending to be nonchalant, but her fingers were gripping the magazine a little too tightly. "Saw your work ID on the counter," she muttered. Nathaniel exhaled. Right. Makes sense. But something about the way she had asked sat wrong with him. Lancaster and Hayes wasn't some random company. It was one of the biggest investment firms in the city. The kind of place that didn't hire people like him unless they were willing to scrape by in the lower ranks. And it sure as hell wasn't the kind of place a homeless teenager would have any reason to care about. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. You know something about it? Lena shrugged. Not really. Lie. He could feel it. But before he could push, she changed the subject. What do you do there? Nathaniel hesitated. Data entry. Lots of spreadsheets. Lots of numbers. Pretty boring stuff. Sounds it. He studied her carefully, trying to read her expression. But Lena was good at hiding. Not just physically, but emotionally too. She had walls. Big ones. And now Nathaniel was sure of one thing. She wasn't just any homeless kid. She had some connection to Lancaster and Hayes. But what? A risky move. That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. The thought kept circling his mind over and over. Why had Lena reacted so strangely to the name of his workplace? Was it possible she was connected to someone there? An employee? A former worker? Or something else entirely? The curiosity became unbearable. So, against his better judgment, he made a decision. He would take her to the office. Not inside, of course. There was no way he could just waltz in with a teenager who had no business being there. But maybe if she saw the building, if she got close to it, she would slip. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally get some answers. The visit. The next morning, over breakfast, he casually dropped the idea. I was thinking of taking you out today. Lena glanced up from her plate, immediately suspicious. Out where? Nowhere fancy, he said, keeping his tone light. Just around. Maybe near where I work. She froze. Just for a second. But he caught it. Nathaniel kept his expression neutral. Figured you might want to get out of the apartment for a bit. Lena hesitated. I don't know. We don't have to go inside, he reassured her. Just a walk around the area. You can grab a coffee or something. My treat. Silence. Then, finally, she gave a small nod. Okay. Nathaniel exhaled. Cool. But in his gut, he knew. Something was about to happen. The shock. By the time they reached Lancaster and Hayes, Nathaniel could see Lena was trying really hard to act normal. She kept her hands stuffed in her hoodie pockets, kept her face down, kept glancing around like she was expecting someone to recognize her. And then, just as they passed the main entrance, it happened. A woman in a sharp, navy blue suit stepped out of the building, talking rapidly into her phone. She was in her mid-50s, with short, graying hair and the kind of posture that screamed power. Lena saw her and stopped dead. Nathaniel didn't miss the way her breath hitched, didn't miss the way her grip on her backpack tightened. The woman kept walking, oblivious to the girl staring at her like she had seen a ghost. And then, Lena did something Nathaniel never expected. She turned on her heel and ran. Natally, the woman's voice rang out. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. What? Lena stopped. Just for a second. Then she bolted again. Nathaniel barely had time to react before he was sprinting after her. Lena, stop. But she didn't stop. And for the first time, Nathaniel knew for sure. Lena wasn't just some runaway. She had a past. A past tied to Lancaster and Hayes. And somehow, she had just been recognized. Who was she really? And what had she been running from all this time? The truth begins to unravel. Nathaniel's heart pounded as he chased after Lena. She was fast, far too fast for someone who had been surviving on the streets. She weaved through the crowd with practiced ease, dodging people, slipping past obstacles like she had done this 100 times before. But Nathaniel had spent years walking these streets. He knew the shortcuts, the alleyways, the dead ends, and he knew exactly where she was headed. He cut through a side street, ignoring the protests of a delivery man as he knocked over a cart of newspapers. Up ahead, he saw her, a blur of motion, desperately trying to lose him. Lena, stop, he called. She didn't. But she made a mistake. Instead of taking a straight path, she veered left, toward a narrow alley. Nathaniel knew that alley. It was a dead end. Trapped. By the time he reached her, she was standing at the far end, staring at the towering brick wall in front of her. Her breathing was ragged, her hands clenched into fists. Nathaniel slowed his steps, careful not to startle her. Lena. She didn't turn around. Who was that woman? He asked gently. Silence. Nathaniel took a slow step closer. She called you Natalie. Still nothing. I'm not mad, he assured her. She wasn't supposed to see me, Lena whispered. Nathaniel froze. Her voice was small, almost fragile. She wasn't supposed to see me, she repeated, her hands trembling now. Nathaniel took another step, closing the distance. Who is she? Lena swallowed hard. Then, slowly, she turned around. My mother. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Nathaniel had suspected she had some connection to Lancaster and Hayes, but he had never expected this. His mind raced. If that woman was her mother, and she worked at the company, that meant Lena wasn't just connected to Lancaster and Hayes. She was a part of it. The missing heiress. Nathaniel pieced it together quickly. Lancaster and Hayes was owned by one of the wealthiest families in the city, the Lancasters, and if Lena's mother worked there. No way, he muttered. Lena's eyes flickered to his face, filled with something between fear and exhaustion. I saw something about this years ago, Nathaniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The Lancaster family. Their daughter went missing. Lena flinched. Everyone thought she was kidnapped, Nathaniel said slowly. The police searched for years, but nothing. She just vanished. Lena's hands curled into fists. Natalie Lancaster, Nathaniel murmured. That's you, isn't it? Lena turned away, pressing her forehead against the cold brick wall. Nathaniel exhaled. How did you end up homeless? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's a long story. We have time, he said softly. Lena was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she spoke. The night everything changed. I didn't get kidnapped, she said quietly. I ran away. Nathaniel frowned. Why? She took a deep breath. Because I was never supposed to exist. Nathaniel blinked. What do you mean? Lena stared at the ground. My father, Elliot Lancaster, was one of the richest men in the country. Powerful, respected. The kind of man who controlled everything around him. Nathaniel nodded. He had heard the name before. Elliot Lancaster had been a titan of industry, a man who built an empire from nothing. But there was one thing he couldn't control, Lena continued. Me. Nathaniel stayed quiet, letting her speak at her own pace. My father had an affair, she said bitterly, with one of his employees, my mother. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. When she got pregnant, he panicked. Lena went on. He already had a family, a wife, 2 sons. I was a mistake, an accident. Nathaniel clenched his jaw. He had seen this story before. A powerful man, a secret child, a life swept under the rug. But he couldn't just get rid of me, Lena said. That would have been a scandal. So instead, he did the next best thing. She looked up, her dark eyes burning with anger. He hid me. Nathaniel felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? I grew up in the shadows, she said. No public records, no photos, no birthday parties, nothing. I wasn't allowed to leave the house. I wasn't allowed to have friends. To the world, I didn't exist. Nathaniel's heart ached for her. I used to dream about running away, Lena admitted, but I was too scared, too naive. Until one day, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to. Nathaniel waited. My father, she whispered. He was planning to send me away. The boarding school, he called it. But it wasn't a school. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists. It was a private facility, Lena said, her voice shaking. Somewhere no one would ever find me. Somewhere I wouldn't be a problem anymore. She took a deep breath. So I ran. Years in the shadows. Nathaniel could barely process what he was hearing. She had been surviving on the streets since she was a child. "How did no one find you?" he asked. "Your family." "They didn't look," she said bitterly. "Or maybe they did, and they just didn't want to find me." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "I learned how to blend in," she continued. "How to hide. How to survive." She let out a humorless laugh. "And for a while, I was doing fine. Until you found me." Nathaniel swallowed. "Lena." "I should go," she muttered, stepping away. "Now that she's seen me, she'll—" "I won't let them take you," Nathaniel interrupted. Lena froze. He took a deep breath. "You don't have to run anymore." She shook her head. "You don't understand. If they find me, we'll figure it out," he said firmly. "Together." Lena looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. And for the first time, she saw none. A decision that changes everything. Nathaniel knew he was in deep. He had taken in a homeless girl, thinking he was just helping someone in need. But now, he was standing next to the lost daughter of one of the most powerful families in the country, and her past was coming back for her. Nathaniel didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain. He wasn't letting Lena face it alone. A reckoning with the past. Nathaniel knew they had no time to waste. Lena's mother had seen her. That meant the entire Lancaster family would know she was alive, if they didn't already. He placed a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. "We have to go." Lena hesitated, looking back toward the alley's entrance as if she could still escape. But there was no more running. She had been running for years, and for the first time, she wasn't alone. She met Nathaniel's eyes, searching for doubt. She found none. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay." Together, they stepped out of the alley and back into the world that had long forgotten her. An unwanted invitation. The next morning, Nathaniel's apartment was silent. He had let Lena take the bed while he took the couch, though she barely slept. Neither of them did. By the time the sun rose, the anxiety had settled into a crushing weight in their chests. Then came the knock. Lena flinched. Nathaniel exchanged a glance with her before cautiously moving toward the door. He peered through the peephole. A man in a sharp black suit stood on the other side. His expression was unreadable, but his presence screamed power. Nathaniel sighed. He knew this moment was coming. With one final glance at Lena, he opened the door. The man didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "Mr. Miller," the man said coolly, handing over a thick, embossed envelope. "You and Miss Lancaster are expected at the Lancaster estate this evening, 7 p.m. sharp. I suggest you don't decline." Nathaniel took the envelope, his fingers tightening around it. The man gave him a curt nod before walking away, disappearing down the hall like a shadow. Nathaniel closed the door and turned to Lena. She was already shaking her head. "I'm not going," she whispered. He held up the envelope. "You don't have a choice." Walking into the lion's den. The Lancaster estate loomed ahead, an architectural masterpiece built on wealth and arrogance. The iron gates stood tall, nearly impassable, but the moment they approached, they swung open as if the house itself had been expecting her. Nathaniel glanced at Lena. Her face was unreadable, but he could feel the tension radiating off her. As they reached the massive front doors, they opened before they could even knock. A butler with a perfectly polished demeanor greeted them. "Right this way." They were led through a grand hall, lined with priceless paintings and expensive chandeliers, each step echoing against the marble floors. At the far end of the hall, in a lavish sitting room, waited the Lancaster family. Nathaniel's stomach tightened. An older man with piercing blue eyes sat at the head of the room. Elliot Lancaster. Even in his 60s, his presence was overwhelming. Beside him sat a woman with perfectly styled hair and an icy expression. Mrs. Lancaster. To their right, 2 men in tailored suits, Lena's half-brothers, Oliver and Charles. And on the far side, eyes filled with barely restrained emotion, was the woman from the office. Lena's mother. Ah. Elliot's voice was smooth, measured. The lost child returns. The cold welcome. Lena didn't react. She stood tall, unreadable, refusing to let him see her flinch. Elliot leaned back in his chair. You should have stayed gone. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. Lena, however, let out a humorless laugh, still warm and fatherly as ever. I see. Elliot's lips twitched, but he remained composed. You're here now, so let's get to the point. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. You've been gone for years. You have no legal claim to this family, no inheritance, no rights. If you think you can come back and... I don't want anything from you, Lena interrupted. Elliot raised an eyebrow. No, I didn't come back, she said sharply. You found me. Her mother finally spoke. We never stopped looking for you. Lena's gaze flickered to her, her expression darkening. Don't. Her mother flinched but held her ground. You were a child. You didn't understand what was happening. Oh, I understood perfectly. Lena shot back. I was a mistake. A secret, something to be hidden away. Elliot's jaw tightened. You were a liability. Nathaniel had heard enough. She was a child, he said coldly. Elliot's gaze shifted to him for the first time, as if finally acknowledging his presence. And who are you exactly? Nathaniel met his stare without hesitation. The person who actually cared when she had nowhere to go. A tense silence filled the room. A dangerous offer. Elliot leaned back, assessing Nathaniel with quiet amusement. Well, he mused, since you seem so invested in her well-being, perhaps you'll understand what I'm about to offer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. Nathaniel's stomach turned. He had seen this before, a classic power move from a man who thought he could buy his way out of anything. Elliot wrote a number on the check, tore it out, and placed it on the table between them. Nathaniel didn't need to look at it to know it was an obscene amount. Take it, Elliot said. Walk away. Forget you ever met her. Nathaniel didn't move. Lena let out a soft, bitter laugh. You think you can just pay him to leave? Elliot smirked. That's how the world works, sweetheart. Nathaniel picked up the check. For a brief moment, he let Elliot think he had won. Then, slowly, he tore it in half. Elliot's smirk faltered. Nathaniel let the pieces fall to the table. That's how your world works. Silence. Then, a slow clap echoed through the room. Oliver, Lena's half-brother, smirked from across the room. Well, that was dramatic. Elliot's expression darkened. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Nathaniel didn't blink. Neither do you. The choice. Lena exhaled, shoulders tense. Are we done here? Elliot studied her carefully. You're nothing to this family. If you walk out that door, you're never coming back. Lena stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. Good. She turned on her heel, heading for the door. Nathaniel followed without hesitation. But just before they reached the exit, Lena's mother called out. Wait. Lena hesitated, but she didn't turn around. Her mother's voice was softer now. I just wanted to know if you're happy. Lena swallowed hard. Then, finally, she spoke. I'm free. And with that, she walked out the door, leaving her past behind her. A new beginning. The night air was crisp as they stepped outside. Nathaniel looked over at her. Are you okay? Lena let out a deep breath. For the first time, in a long time, she admitted, I think I might be. Nathaniel smiled. So what now? She thought for a moment. Then she grinned. Let's find out. And together, they walked into the unknown, toward a future they would build for themselves. Shadows of the past. The Lancaster estate faded into the distance, swallowed by the cold night as Lena and Nathaniel walked away. But even as they left, a feeling lingered, one of unfinished business. Nathaniel could see it in the way Lena's shoulders remained stiff, The way she clenched and unclenched her fists, as though she were trying to shake off the weight of everything that had just happened. As they reached his car, she hesitated. "Do you think he'll leave me alone?" Nathaniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Elliot Lancaster doesn't strike me as the type to let things go." Lena let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, I figured." They got into the car, but before Nathaniel could start the engine, she turned to him. "I need to know the truth." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She stared straight ahead, her voice quieter now. "Why did I end up on the streets, Nathaniel? Why did my own mother?" She swallowed. "Why did she let it happen? There's more to this. I can feel it." Nathaniel gripped the steering wheel. "And you want to go digging?" Lena met his eyes. "I have to." A tense silence passed between them before Nathaniel nodded. "Then we start tonight. A trail of secrets." Nathaniel drove through the quiet streets, the city lights blurring past. He had no idea where to start, but Lena did. "The Lancaster family has always kept tight control over their image," she said. "If they erased me from their lives, they would have left some kind of paper trail." Nathaniel's eyebrows furrowed. "You think we can find something official?" She nodded. "There's only one place where records like that would be kept. Lancaster Industries." Nathaniel stiffened. "You want to break into the company?" Lena smirked. "Who said anything about breaking in? I know someone who still works there. Someone who owes me a favor." The inside man. An hour later, they pulled up to a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city. Inside, a man in his early 40s sat in the corner, nursing a coffee. His hair was graying at the edges, and deep bags sat under his eyes, as though he hadn't slept in days. Lena approached the table first. "Hello, Harold." The man looked up, his eyes widening slightly before narrowing in suspicion. "Lena Lancaster. Thought you were dead." Lena smirked. Disappointed. Harold let out a dry chuckle. "Not particularly. Just surprised." He gestured for them to sit. "So, what brings you here?" Nathaniel spoke up. "We need access to Lancaster Industries' old records." Harold raised an eyebrow. "And why would I help you?" Lena leaned forward. "Because I remember what you did." Harold stiffened. Nathaniel glanced between them. "What did he do?" Lena kept her gaze locked on Harold. "Back when I was a kid, my father made a lot of people disappear. Employees, investors, even family. But I remember one night, you were supposed to erase someone from the system." Harold's jaw clenched. Lena tilted her head. "That someone was me, wasn't it?" Harold exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. "You were just a kid. I didn't ask questions. I just did my job." Lena narrowed her eyes. "Then why didn't you erase me completely?" Harold's fingers tapped against the table. "Because something felt off about the whole thing. Your father was furious, more than usual. And then, one night, your mother came to me with a request." Lena froze. "My mother?" Harold nodded. "She wanted me to leave a back door in the system, just in case. She said that if you ever came back, you'd need a way to find the truth." Lena's throat tightened. Harold sighed. "I can get you into the system, but it won't be easy. Your father has locked down most of the sensitive files." Lena leaned in. "We don't need everything, just enough to know why I was abandoned." Harold hesitated, then nodded. "Meet me tomorrow night at Lancaster Tower. I'll get you in." The return to Lancaster Industries. The next night, Lena and Nathaniel stood outside Lancaster Tower. The sleek skyscraper loomed over them, its glass walls reflecting the city lights. Nathaniel adjusted the collar of his jacket. "Are we sure about this?" Lena smirked. "Too late to back out now." The front doors were locked for the night, but Harold had given them special access. A few moments later, the doors clicked open, and they stepped inside. The building was eerily quiet. Nathaniel followed Lena through the empty halls, his nerves on edge. Harold met them near an old security room. You've got 10 minutes before the system resets and logs my access, he warned. Make it count. Lena sat down at the terminal, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Nathaniel watched as screen after screen of confidential files appeared before them. Then she found it. A folder labeled Project Obsidian. Lena clicked it open. Inside, dozens of documents filled the screen. Medical reports, financial records, a sealed adoption file. Nathaniel's breath caught. What the hell is this? Lena scrolled further until she saw her name. And beneath it, another name. Biological father, Elliot Lancaster. Biological mother, unknown. Lena's heart pounded. Wait, this isn't right. Nathaniel frowned. What do you mean? Lena's voice was barely a whisper. It says my mother is unknown. But my mother was right there in the estate. Nathaniel's stomach dropped. What if? Lena's hands trembled as she opened another file. A DNA test result. Her pulse roared in her ears as she read the final words. Subject's biological mother does not match current records. Nathaniel's breath hitched. Lena, she's not your mother. Lena's world shattered. If the woman she had called mother wasn't actually related to her, then who was? And why had the Lancaster family spent years hiding the truth? Nathaniel grabbed her arm. We need to go. Now. Lena tore her gaze from the screen, her mind racing. Harold's voice came through the earpiece. Guys, we have a problem. Security's been tripped. You have less than 2 minutes to get out. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He pulled Lena from the chair, and they bolted out of the room. Behind them, red emergency lights flashed. They sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. As they reached the exit, a chilling voice rang out behind them. Well. They froze. Elliot Lancaster stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, flanked by 2 security guards. His lips curled into a smirk. I was wondering when you'd finally dig deep enough to find the truth. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Elliot's eyes gleamed with something dark. Welcome to the real game, my dear.